Today's daf is daf pei, and we're going to start with Omer Reish Lakish on the bottom of daf Ayin Tesamid Beis. Lo shanu. When do we rely on a chazaka called Bonim Ktanim Kruchim Achar Imam Ela B'Kodshei Gvul? We're not going to establish their yichus based on Kruchim Lefanea for Yuchsid, to allow the daughter to marry a Kohen, but only to allow her to eat Truma, because Truma is called Kodshei Gvul. It can be eaten anywhere in Eretz Yisrael, and it's not Dinei Ishus, which is like a Dover Shebe'erva. So therefore, if the father's a Kohen, then Kruchim Achareha is enough to establish that these children are the Bnei Isha, and therefore they can eat Truma. And they're not Chalolim. However, Aval B'Yuchsin Lo. We can't marry them off to Kohanim until we bring a raya shehein b'noseha shela isha miyucheses. In other words, we're not going to rely on Kruchim Achareha to establish that this daughter is the biological daughter of this mother, who we know was checked out for Yuchsin. That's the opinion of Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. V'yamar afilu b'Yuchsin. Once we rely on Kruchim Achareha, Kruchim Achareha is an absolute chazaka, reliable chazaka, that establishes that this is the child of the mother. The mother has already had a bedika, and we know she's a miyucheses, and therefore establishing that this is her child, this girl is allowed to be married off to a Kohen, and we assume she's a miyucheses. V'yazda Rabbi Yochanan tamei, and Rabbi Yochanan, by relying on the chazaka of Kruchim Achareha, is very consistent. And his opinion is ha'isur bi'eid echad muchzak or ha'isur b'chazaka muchzekes. The Omer Rav Chia bar Rabban Rabbi Yochanan malkin al chazakos. Whenever we establish an isur based on a chazaka, even in the absence of edim, we will now give malchus if he violates that isur. And not only that, soklin v'sarfin al chazakos. We can rely on a chazaka and condemn a person to a capital crime for which he gets skila based on a chazaka. And not only that, when we have taros or truma, we can burn the truma based on a chazaka that it became tameh. But the ain't sorfin truma al chazakos. In other words, Sarfin al pi chazakos, which would mean that we put someone to death. We'll see which erva generates a chiyuv sreifa based on a chazak. But we won't burn truma and establish that it's definitely vadai truma tmeya based on a chazaka. But in any event, Rabbi Yochanan certainly says that we rely on chazaka for dinei nefashos, and how much more so for yuchsin, to be machshir the bas for kahuna. So the Gemara now analyzes. Malkin al chazokos ki Rabbi Yehuda, the Yom Rabbi Yehuda huchzakod nida v'shchenos seah baila lo koleh mishum nida. If the shchenos saw that she wore the malbush, the levush of begodim shenogos hanidos lilbosh, that they wore a certain kind of white begodim, and then she becomes huchzakah as a nida. If that be the case, if the Baal had relations with her, he gets malchus, assuming there was hasra and edim, based on a chazaka. And that is the shita of Yochanan, like Rabbi Yehuda. Next, soklin v'sarfet al chazakas, kidarabba barav huna, the Yom Rabba huna. Ish ve'isha, a man and a woman were together with a tinok v'tinoka shegdilu, betoch habayis, and there was a baby boy and a baby girl that they raised in the house. And there's a chazaka that the Isha and the Isha are Baal the Isha. And the Tinok and the Tinokos are their children. There are no Eden. Is Niskolama Yidei Zeh, if the Ben would have a relationship with his mother, then he gets skila, and she also will get skila. The imba al Abbas, Nisrafim also, a father who has a relationship with his own daughter is Chayiv Sreifa. And all this is based on a chazaka because we have a chazaka that he and she are married and that these are their children. Amar Rav Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rav Yeshua ben Levi, Mishum bar Kapar Ma'isa be'isha shebol Yerushalayim etinok murkav la kseifa. So again, we have a chazaka that this child, this male child, is the daughter, is the son, of his mother. And she raised him b'chazaka that this is her son. And then Baaleh, he had a relationship with his own mother. Now, this appealed to me that they had skila at that time. But in any event, why did they give him skila? Lo mipnei shebno vadai, not because there were any edim that could establish that this was her son, el mipnei shekara chachrea, because of this chazaka that we saw in Rabbi Yochanan, soklin al chazakos, because the mother raised the child. Third din, ein sarfin trumas al chazakas, the Amar Shimon Lakish, sarfin al chazakas, Rabbi Yochanan Omer, ein sarfin al pi chazakos. Now, what does this mean? So to understand this, we have to learn the Mishnah in Taras Perek Gimel, Ozlu Tamayu Disnan, Tinok Shenimtza B'tzad Isa. So we find a child in a Rishus HaYachid who is contiguous. He's next to a dough. The botzek, a chatich of the botzek from this dough is biyado, is in the hands of the tina. Rabbi Meir Mitayr. Rabbi Meir Mitayr means that the piece that he's holding on to is problematic, but the rest of the dough is tar. In other words, we don't assume that when the tino came in contact with the dough, he was mitami betuma through negia, through mago. Chacham mitami. Why? Why did Chacham assume that the isa is tmeya? Mipnei shedarko shel tino l'tapeach. The tino goes into the ashpa where you find all sorts of things that are mitame, shrotzim, and avelos, and whatnot. He became tame, and now when he touched the isa, he was mitame the isa. V'avinu ba my time in the Rabbi Meir. So right now the ball is in the court of the Chachamim, and the Gemara asks, what is Rabbi Meir going to argue here? Does he reject the principle of darko shel tinok l'kapeach bi'ashpa? And the Gemara answers, Kasava rov tinokos mitapchin umire mitapchin v'isa v'techeskas taro meres is smoch miutel chazaka v'Yisraelei ruba. It's a famous sheet of Rabbi Meir that when you have a rov and a miut, and the rov is contradicted by a chazaka, so the chazaka supports the miut, then we attach the chazaka to support the miut, and therefore we override the rov. Here too, we have rov tinokus mitavchin biashpa, and it's meim. We have miut tinokus she'ein mitavchin biashpa, and we have the cheskas tara of the isa. So we take the cheskas tara of the isa, and we use it as support for the rov, for the miut, and that's called smoch miut l'chazaka. Again, the language of the Gemara, Reb Meir seems to assume that the miut is going to support the chazaka. I would say it the other way around, that smoch chazaka l'miuta, the Yisraelei ruba. And now we weaken the rov that says that tinokus avatavcha biashpa, which is the whole reason why we established that tumah. And Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Meir. They hold miuta command the lesser dummy. Rov completely neutralizes and undermines and cancels the miut, and you're left with a rov against chazaka, and ruva chazaka, ruva adif rov overrides a chazaka. Now, why does rov override a chazaka? Here we get into two different concepts. There's one concept called a birur, and there's another concept called a din or a hanhaga. And a birur is always stronger and trumps hanhaga. So chazaka doesn't really tell us much. I mean, the fact that there was a chazaka vis-a-vis this isa, that it was becheskes tara, doesn't really tell you a thing about the Isa. It once was Tar, but now the question is, did it become Tameh? Whereas Rov is a Biru. And therefore it's Gover ala Chazaka. The Isa is therefore an Isa Tameh. The Amar Reish Lakish, Mishum Rabbi Oshia, this din of the Chacham, that the Isa is Tmeya. And why? Because there's a Rov Tinokus Metachim Isa Biyashba Zui Chazaka Shesarfin Alesa Truma. Reish Lakish is of the opinion that when the Chachamim rely on this Rov, that's enough to establish Bivados that the Truma is Tmeya, and therefore we burn the Truma. And that's what it means when the Chacham said Tmeim. Tmeim means that it's Truma Tmeya Bivados and Sarfin Oles HaTruma. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, no. Ein zo chazaka Sarfin Oles HaTruma. This chazaka cannot create a din vada. Despite the rov that the tinok is metaper beisa be'betuma be'ashpa, nevertheless it still remains a suffix, and you want to take the truma out of its cheskas tara based on a suffix. We can't burn the truma. We don't eat the truma because it's a suffix truma tmeya. But the chacham, when they say metamim, they were only referring to the Isra Achila, but as far as Sreifa is concerned, for that we need a Vada. Because you're not allowed to burn Truma unless it's Tmei. It's got to be Vada Tmei. So Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish basically are arguing about Sorfin and Satrum Pichazakas, Lishitasam, in the way they interpreted the Mishnah and Taros in two different ways. Now, the language of Rabbi Yochanan lends itself to a diuk. If you read Rabbi Yochanan's words very meticulously, he says, "Ein zu chazaka shesorfen aletrum." This chazaka is not reliable, implying that there does exist somewhere in the world a chazaka that we can burn. That based on that chazaka we could burn the truma. So Gemara says, "Ala eza chazaka of Yochanan sorfen aleha." That's a truma. Kiddushin, like we learned in the Mishnah, and the Masoras Hashas changes this. It should be Kiddusanya, like we learned in the Brisa. Isa betoch habayis ushrotzim utzfardim mitaplim sham. Note that a sheretz is tamid and it's metamid. A tzfardea is tar. And now you've got an Isa, and inside the house there are both shrotzim and tzfardim. Mitaplin sham, and we find that the shrotzim and the tzfardim are mapilim chatichos migufa. So on the ground there in the bayis, there are little pieces of shrotzim and tzfardim. Probably means after they died and they start to disintegrate. And some of the pieces of the skin or the flesh of these shrotzim and tzfardim are found in the Isa. So now we have to figure out which chatichos are in the Isa. Is it from the shrotzim and it's tameh, or from the tzfardim and it's tar? So the Brisa establishes, in rov shrotzim, if in this house there are more shrotzim than tzfardim, tmeya. The in rov tzfardim, if there are more tzfardim then shrotzim is tahora. This is tahora. Regarding this chazaka, Rabbi Yochanan Paskin, Sarfin al Piyasa Isa mi Truma. We can take Truma and we can burn it. In other words, once there's a chazaka that there's rov shrotzim in the house, that is what we call a ruba de Isa kaman. We'll try to explain that. And based on this rov, we create a vadai, and therefore we could burn the Truma. So since there's rov shrotzim, and that's a ruba de Isa kaman. And the Rishonim explain in the Mishnah that we quoted earlier about a tinokos hametapeach. There, the rov is a ruba de lesa kaman. We don't know that. We don't know anything more than the teva. I mean, the nature, the psychology of tinokos in the world is to be metapeach bi'ashpa. But the rov doesn't tell us anything about this particular case. Tosfos, on the other hand, has a different explanation. He says that the difference is that Rov Tinokus Metaplim Ashva is a Rov Garua, but Rov Shvatzim V'Bayis is a Rov Tov, because Rov Tinokus Metaplim is a Rov that's totally in Maisa. I guess it's a psychological thing, and it's Garua. But Rov Shvatzim is a Rov that's right in front of our eyes. It's not something that you could question and that it would change. Now the Gemara wants to bring a brisa, and just 1 second, I just want to make sure this is off. Yeah. And this brisa that we're about to learn is a support text for Rav Yochanan, that according to Chachamim, in the case of a tinok who's tapech beisa, the tomb is only safek and not fada. Ain't sorfinally. Tanya Kavasi Rav Yochanan. Now we have to make an introduction, a difference between yesh bodas lishol and ein bodas lishol. We differentiate between safek tumah shus harab and shus hayachid based on sota only in a davar yesh bodas lishol. But in a case of ein bodas lishol, then whether or not it's Rishus HaYachid, or even if it's in Rishus HaRab, whether or not it's in Rishus HaRab, or even if it's in Rishus HaYachid, Sveiko Tor. Shnei Dvarim ein be'em das v'asal chachamim k'mo sheyesh be'em das. But there are two cases where we have a Safek and there's no Ben Das, and therefore on a Doraisa level we should say Sveiko Tor even in Rishus HaYachid, but the Chachamim gave it a din of Yesh Bo Das Lishoel and Safek Birshus Hayachid Sveiko Tomei. So what are these two things? Number one is Tinok, which means that Mitzad Adin, in the case of Tinok, on a Doraisa level, we'd say Sveiko Tor Birshus Harabim, V'yod Acheres. Okay, we'll see what V'yod Acheres means. Tinok Hadi Amara. If the Tinok is found next to the Isa is Tmeya, and even though we cannot totally clarify by asking the Tinok, were you metapech be'ashba and you contracted tumah? The Chachamim made it into and subsumed it on the Yesh Bodas Lishol and Rishus HaYachid it's tameh. So the Gemara says, "V'od Acheres Maihi." What's the V'od Acheres? And the Gemara answers, "Isa b'toch habayis b'tarnagolim u'mashkim tmeim shon." So you've got mashkim tmeim in the same house as tarnagolim, and we assume that tarnagolim drank from the mashkim tmeim. And now, when the tarnagolim start pecking away at an isa, their mouth is, or mouths, I guess you'd say, is full of these mashkim tmeim. The nimtzu and nekurim on the top of daf peyom and beis.